Dziękuję bardzo. Okay, let's switch to English. Welcome everyone. As Mr. Jarosław already explained, the topic of the panel today will be the experiences of the implementation of the 5th and 6th directive outside of Poland. Before we get on to the questions, Thomas, Adam, do you want to give a little bit of more introduction into your background?
Yes, happy to do so, Adam. I'll go first, maybe. I'm Thomas. As said, I'm the current Group Money Laundering Officer for N26. In this role, I have been very instrumental in building up the AML and AFC setup for the past 2 years for N26, going through the stages of hypergrowth, obviously, as N26 is one of the largest fintechs, neobanks in Europe. So we have gone through a very hypergrowth from AFC perspective, really scaling up the game. And obviously, as we are a cross-continental bank, we're obviously faced with the regulatory changes from the 5th and 6th MRD. In particular for us, and I think this is the topics we're going to touch today, the increased criminal liability changes that especially affect the German law, but also just in general, the increased unharmonized KYC standards. And from our side, just the biggest challenges right now is how can we cope with these changes, specifically as we also want to branch out to corporate clients maybe in the future. But over to you, Adam, for a quick intro.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Adam McLaughlin, and I'm the Global Head for AML Strategy for NICE Actimize. I haven't always been in the vendor space. I was originally in the operational role. So before joining Actimize as an SME, I was working at JP Morgan, and I was the manager for the AML investigations team. So I managed the AML investigations all the way from alert to SAR filings. I did that role for a number of years, and before that I was a police officer. So I was in law enforcement for 10 years in the UK. I was a police detective, and I spent a large part of my career investigating financial crime, organised crime groups, and managing investigation teams doing such. So I have got a lot of experience from all sides of the fence, so to speak. And yeah, today I'm going to talk about my experiences with the 5th and 6th directive, primarily in my current role, having spoken to lots of different clients around Europe and beyond.
Let me start with an open general question, as in what was the biggest challenge that you've seen, the biggest themes of 5th and 6th Money Directive implementation?
I can go first there. As I said before, for us, the 5th really didn't have that much change for us because we had considered the largest changes there to more corporate clients and the transparency register. For us, however, the implementation now of the 5th/6th in Germany, now with the recent change in law and in terms of the criminal liability, has been the largest change. So what has happened in Germany is that the criminality of money laundering, sort of the precursor crime, has been extended. So basically there are no limitations anymore, which basically which is reimagining of a financial institution, what it means, what is our constitutes of. So this means basically that from the legal standards, regulatory standard, that more crimes are associated to money laundering. This means also that more crimes have to be monitored, which I think is a huge difficulty. And I think this is something Adam can also speak of, probably from Actimize's perspective, that it not only becomes now difficulty to to monitor against typical money laundering scenarios, like high cash withdrawals, smurfing rules or so, but also to figure out how can you monitor against non-financial crimes. So, for example, environmental crimes or corruption, bribery, like how do you monitor against actively? And in Germany, there's actually one interesting case that I would like to share. I don't know if it's the same in Poland, that technically speaking, gambling, for example, is illegal in most of German states. There's only one state which allows gambling. And so there is considerations by multiple financial institutions whether to consider gambling already enough, if a customer conducts gambling, already enough to file a ZAR on this customer. If this would happen, obviously you would see an increase by 10 to 100 times of the SARs that is expected by the industry right now, which then comes up the question, is this to be handled by the financial institutions well? Is the capacity enough? And B, is there enough capacity on the law enforcement side to really handle this much volume if most of the things that come in are white noise?
Right, thanks for that, Thomas. Very interesting. I do have some questions on what you've said, but before that, let's switch to Adam, and if you could, Adam, give an overview of what it looks like from your perspective. What's the biggest theme, the biggest challenge?
Sure, thank you. So, I think I would agree with a lot of stuff that Thomas has said in terms of what I'm seeing. I think, what is the fifth directive? The fifth directive was ultimately to cover some gaps and involving threat issues beyond the fourth directive, which came in 2017 to align to the PATF standards. Financial. I think it just shows that financial crime moves on and it evolves, and the EU have had to adapt to the involvement with the fifth directive and ultimately the sixth. In terms of the fifth, one thing I've seen a lot probably across Europe is the crypto regulations. So I've seen a lot of crypto firms coming now saying we need a solution beyond the manual processing we did to comply with the regulations that have come in across Europe for monitoring of crypto. Because now firms are obliged entities, they have to register with regulators, and they also have to know your customer. So they have to do the KYC checks, they have to understand the transactions and the activity the customer's conducting within the organization. And a lot of firms I've seen, especially the smaller firms that are startups, were operating very manually. So they had Excel sheets, paper, and list of clients, and they're trying to do lots of manual checking. And the regulators are just like, that isn't good enough anymore. If you want to be regulated, you have to automate your processes. And they've been scrambling to try and find solutions. That's probably not the case now so much. We're not seeing so many people coming forward saying we're desperate to get a solution, because everyone knew this was coming. It got transposed last year, and the firms are now having to apply, if not already applied, to be regulated. So that is probably a thing that happened, but I'm not seeing that so much now, the scrambling around to get it. One thing I'm now seeing though, it's not regulated per se, but I'm seeing a lot of fiat banks coming to us saying we need to monitor crypto. So some of them start looking to get into crypto, but some of them, they don't understand what the customers are doing in crypto. Crypto's become quite mainstream, especially Bitcoin. And so you've got lots of customers in fiat banks who are transferring money to a crypto exchange or a crypto wallet. And this is fiat currency being transferred. But the fiat banks don't understand the crypto world. They don't understand the risks the exchanges and the wallets are, which ones are dealing in dark web activity, which ones are dealing in terrorist activity, which ones are high risk. The fiat banks don't have any visibility. So they're coming to us saying, we need to find a way to monitor the activity in crypto that our fiat customers are doing, because ultimately crypto, there's an exit point and an entry point. And ultimately it's fiat. In either side of a crypto transaction, there'll be fiat currency somewhere. It may not be in the future. I think crypto, the more as it gets more mainstream and it starts getting, you can start transacting, in retail banks and retail environments with crypto. I think that transfer between fiat will be less and less. But at the moment, most organizations do not take crypto as payment, so you have to transfer it. So I'm seeing that quite a lot. I think the beneficial owner thing, like Thomas said, is exactly that's what everyone's focusing on, is the UBO. Understand the UBOs. How can we understand them? How can we understand the complex structures? I think there's one point within the UBO thing within the fifth, which is interesting. We're getting people asking, how can we do this? And this is about the verification of UBOs. So within the regulation was member states have to strengthen UBO verification mechanisms to ensure the information is accurate and reliable. And the reason why that came in is because, you look at Companies House in the UK, right? Anyone can start up a company in Companies House. I think it's £20 sterling. You pay money, you can set up Mickey Mouse Limited and actually call yourself Mickey Mouse, and you've got a company called Mickey Mouse Limited under the name of Mickey Mouse. Right? There's no validation verification of that. That is, it's that easy. And there has to be a way for organizations, for the financial institutions to validate that information, and for Companies House to validate the information, because at the moment it's a bit useless. There's a company there called Mickey Mouse, but actually behind the scenes, clearly it's not Mickey Mouse owning the company. So that's one thing people are saying, can we automate that process, to APIs to start updating company's house and say to company's house there's a discrepancy in the data. High risk third countries was another one in the fifth. I've seen some firms having to update their EDD processes. Most of them are doing it. I'm not saying they're not, but most of them were doing it anyway. But it's having to get additional information from customers in high risk third countries. Undecided UBO structures when there's probably not that transparency in those countries for the UBO data to be available. So they're looking at ways they can do that with technology. And then I guess moving on to the sixth, money laundering directive, I completely agree with Thomas. But before that one, there's one that I think has been potentially overlooked, and it's the liability of a corporate to commit an offence of money laundering. I find this one quite interesting because, Article 7, Section 2 of the 6th Money Laundering Directive says that legal persons can be held liable where the lack of supervision or control by a person in control has made possible the commission of any offence of conversion, transfer, concealment, disguise, or acquisition, possession or use of property, which is illicit activity. So any of those things that have happened within the organisation, and the legal person, i.e. the executives in the company, should have known or ought to have known the property was criminal property that they were dealing with, there is a liability on them that they can get prosecuted, fines, they can get shut down, and ultimately there can be personal liability on the individuals as well. In my view, this is huge because ultimately it means that the executives that head up companies, the chief executive, the chief compliance officers, they are now more so than they were, personally liable, but also the company's liable. So this comes down to shareholders, potentially being hit hard if a company's not acting and they're failing to act and failing to prevent money laundering. And so what I have been seeing is companies trying to get their houses in order and looking to update their policies, procedures, and making sure that there's no gaps. I know people do it anyway, but I've been seeing a bit of a rush of people saying, right, are we absolutely watertight? And this is coming from the top. This is coming from execs not wanting to go to prison or getting their firm shut down. So that I think that's an interesting one, and I think it's a good step in the right direction. And then finally, and I'll stop after this one, the list of predicate offences, what Thomas said, there's 22 of them. Okay, and so what I have been seeing is firms across Europe, and even some firms beyond who deal with transactions from Europe, looking to map what red flags associate with each predicate crime, i.e. what does this crime look like? Because as someone said, you've got some of the classic ones, human trafficking. There's been a lot of stuff in the press and news and in professional forums about human trafficking. What is it? What does it look like? And how can we monitor it? Illicit trafficking of narcotics, that goes without saying, right? Everyone's been looking for that. And then, like someone said, you've got environmental crime, you've got kidnap and hostage taking, you have things like murder and GBH. Those offences can now amount to, well, what does that look like? Murder, what does financial crime for murder look like? Is this somebody taking someone's card and using their ATM and taking the money out? Is this somebody extorting money out of them? And I think that's what people are trying to find out is, how do those crimes relate to financial crime, first and foremost, and what does it look like in my organisation? And how can I link that back to the predicate crime? So that's what people are grappling with at the moment.
Thank you for that. Very interesting. I've noted the main themes that you both mentioned. It's definitely UBO registries. I also have on the list of predicate offences, the extension of high-risk countries, and liability of corporates, and obviously the introduction of cryptocurrencies businesses, the inclusion rather of them as obliged entities. So with that, I can completely relate to what you said, Adam, about organizations and companies being unsure how to monitor for that. I'll actually skip that subject a little bit. I do have another presentation coming during the day on that subject, coming from Coinfirm, from the crypto asset space. I do want to focus though on those remaining items that you both seem to see as the biggest themes of the directives. And starting, I guess, from the UBO's registries, I think, Adam, you mentioned that some of the clients ask for automated automated checks of the UBOs on an ongoing basis. So there's an interesting concept that I've come across of the idea of perpetual KYC, where with the introduction of UBO registries, the idea behind it would be that the systems managing KYC and financial crime would take the feed from the registries on an ongoing basis, and thus reduce the need for extensive resources to manage KYC reviews. It's a bit of, I would say, a hot subject, but also I'd say a controversial, to the extent of whether or not this is doable. Is it realistic? What do you think? Do you think that we will go into the direction of moving more and more towards automatization and introducing, or trying to introduce at least, that concept of perpetual KYC?
No, absolutely. I think, look, I don't think it's a future thing. I don't think this is a year, 2 years, 3 years out. This is happening now, and companies such as ours are already, to a point, doing this, and it is developing and growing. Pretty much most companies I speak to now, and it isn't just Europe. I'm talking to companies in Africa, Middle East, some in Asia, in America, North America, and they're all wanting to move to this concept of what you say, perpetual KYC. And what that is most firms have to do some sort of periodic review at some point, okay, especially for the medium and high risk customers. Whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, there's some sort of perpetual or periodic review that happens. The danger with that is, if there's no perpetual nature in terms of the monitoring, is, for example, if you've done a periodic review on one day and then 2 weeks later there's some adverse media or something happens to that customer, unless your processes are absolutely on point, there's a potential that you don't capture that until someone raises it manually and goes, oh, have you noticed this, by the way, or there was an alert for somebody, or until the next periodic review, which could be 2, 3 years down the line, which means that potentially your organization is allowing that customer to continue their activity for a couple of years until you go, we should have spotted that like 2 years ago. It happened 2 weeks after we last done our review. And so now there's this concept of perpetual, some people are calling it trigger-based reviewing, some people are calling it activity-based reviewing, but it's the same principle, is that you raise an alert and you change the risk score and you monitor the customer, investigate them based on changes in activity, changes in behavior, or changes in information. And KYC or UBO is one such stream that you can use. Other streams could be, you plug into social media. If someone starts putting some keywords, or they start changing, lots of facts within social media, this needs to be looked at. Some countries have voters' rolls, right? So if someone changes their address and the bank isn't aware of that address difference, raise an alert, say, look, this address has changed. It could be legitimate and genuine. It could be a fraudster who's done an account takeover, or it could just be, someone's become a mule and is going to a corporate account and starting to try and do illicit activity. So, that isn't a future state thing. This is starting to happen now. And on the UBO piece, it's more than possible to do that now. Today, the technology's there. I think the challenge we've got at the moment is having access to the register. It's great doing it, but if you haven't got access to the data, you can't do it. And not all registers at the moment are publicly available and accessible. But if the data is accessible and you can API, and that is a connection that a software will have with a third-party solution to match the data up, it's more than possible to do that. And I think that's what most customers now are asking for, technology such as that.
It's interesting to see which direction it will go in terms of the costs for the financial institutions, because on the one hand we have ever-growing compliance responsibilities, but on the other hand we've got more possibilities to reduce that cost as well through technology. So it's interesting to see, well, what the future will bring in that aspect. I do want to switch for a moment to Thomas, what you said about the extension of criminal liability and the increased number of predicate offences. You outlined the challenges that the financial sector will face with regards to that. In particular, you mentioned the possible increased number of SARS. I was wondering, from your experience, is there sort of a cooperation between private and public sector to address that? Or in other words, do you think that the FIUs, that the regulators are aware of the increase, that the flooding that may be coming into their ways, especially when we look at the numbers of SARs being filed versus number of SARs being responded to by the FIUs? It is not let's say, satisfactory result overall across Europe at the moment. So it will be interesting to see how they handle that with the increased numbers. So what are your experiences on that point?
I mean, I'm not particularly privy of how it is done in Poland. I hope it's being better done in Poland than in Germany. In Germany, obviously, the scalability of the FIU is quite limited. And I think this goes back also to what Adam was saying in terms of the data. The problem is there that you have, for example, an UBO register with the data in it, but the data is so unstructured, and this is the same goes with the FIU or the SARS go, that it's not very useful right now. So the FIU itself, and this is also known in the public, is undergoing a lot of restructuring, especially from a technical side, to really accommodate these changes. They are continuing their hiring spree and expanding their capacity. The current issue that we see with this is that as we are a European bank, we are still operating with the German IBAN. This means that all European customers, so for example, our Polish customers that we have, they would have a German IBAN. This means if we would have a fraudster from Poland, that this person would be filed a SAR against in Germany. This means that the SAR for a Polish customer goes to a German FIU, and that German FIU most of the time doesn't have that direct connection, for example, to the Polish FIU. They would rather send it first to the law enforcement in Germany, that they would prosecute them because we're based in Germany. Now, the issue with this is obviously that you then lose a track of then, following up with the criminal actions. That being said, what is missing essentially on the FIU side right now is a data platform that is really scalable and that also is integratable for all financial institutions. And this means basically that also the intelligence that they have actually is also not useful for the public sector, for the private sector. And this is what comes back to what you were saying is to also put in a practical example in terms of the public and private partnership. It does happen, but it doesn't happen on a very practical level. It happens more on a theoretical level, which is obviously a problem, because what we have seen last year in the COVID-19 crisis, and this is a little bit outside of the box today, but what we had seen is that 4 months after the first government payments for COVID came out, and we had experienced large fraud across all financial institutions, 4 months later, the first typology paper by the FIU was issued. By then, the crisis was already over. This crisis was not going to happen like this anymore. All private institutions that were affected by this had prepared their own typology paper, which is shared across the private institutions. So it's too late, it's too little, and most of the time it's only theoretical, which obviously hampers the effectiveness of the overall setup. And in my opinion, based on this, we have 3 challenges to solve, and then I hand over is, one, I said, the data foundation at the public institutions, so at the FIU. The second is the connectivity between the financial institutions and the FIU, for example, and the back and forth. And then the third one is how do you interact across Europe between the FIUs, even if you're not a local bank, but only operator with passporting rights, because that's a challenge that almost every fintech has to solve, because almost every fintech operates under the passporting rights in Europe.
Yeah, and I can relate to that again from the crypto space. We're seeing a lot of, let's say, doubts and questions as to which FIU to report, given the international coverage of crypto assets and crypto assets companies. They are sometimes registered and licensed in a couple of jurisdictions. Then the question arises, well, I'm looking at a SAR which has a nexus to different countries. Which FIU do I report it to? And to your point about the resources in the FIUs, I do appreciate all the cooperation that we have with FIUs, but I kind of also sympathize with them in terms of the amount of knowledge and build up that they have to do to handle crypto assets SARs as well now, because it does require a little bit of a different skill set, so to speak. So again, interesting to observe how the FIUs will evolve following the amendments to the implementation of 5th and 6th directive. And that brings me to, again, kind of a general question. With everything that we said, I'm still interested in that balance of, do you think that the 5th and 6th AML directive are rather cost producing to the financial institutions, or is that cost offset somehow? So in other words, do you think that the proper implementation of the 5th and 6th directives in financial institutions is a significant cost increase in terms of compliance?
Go ahead, Adam.
I'll start that one, if that's right. So look, I do think in the short term, it may well increase costs for compliance teams within financial institutions. Why do I say that? Because they have to put additional effort into training. So things like the 22 predicate offences, you have to train the staff to do that. Some firms have to put in additional technology solutions to, monitor things. For example, I mentioned about the crypto. They've had to buy technology in order to comply with the regulations. Some firms' solutions that I've seen are quite old solutions that they've implemented years and years ago, and they don't have the flexibility or the agility to adapt quickly to start monitoring for new typologies, new threats. There's 22 predicate offences. If there's new red flags identified, it's the adaptation. So I think there is a cost, and what I think is happening is, rightly or wrongly, the legislators are putting the burden on FI financial institutions to effectively do the policing. So they're basically saying to the financial institutions, here's a load of offences we want you to look for. If there's any money laundering from that, come and let us know, and we'll investigate. Part of it's a resource issue. Part of it's because banks are, benefiting. If they have got criminals on the books, they're financially benefiting. Right or wrong, you can have an argument for hours about this. Whether the bank should be the police or whether the police should be the police. But this is why I see this regulation is putting a lot of the burden onto the bank to do the policing. But I do think the longer term focus of what they're trying to achieve is right. Ultimately they're looking at everyone being more effective. They're looking to align standards across Europe. They're looking to make sure that everyone is singing off the same hymn sheet, so everyone's working off an equal burden. And ultimately, I think their heart is in the right place because they do want to stop financial crime, and I think the legislation's clear. And so I think as we adapt, we change this, and the right technology is put in place, people are trained effectively, I do think the cost will come down because there will be better effectiveness and better focus on the right areas. But yeah, I do think in the short term, just my view, there is going to be a higher cost of compliance just while we adapt.
Yeah, sounds reasonable. I mean, in line with what I'm hearing from the industry. But again, I think the overall voice is, yes, the cost is there, but long term, we understand this is needed. Yeah, go
Can
ahead.
I maybe chime in there? I'm not sure whether the costs will go down in the long term. Maybe on a sort of like scalable perspective, that it goes down on a customer per compliance cost or so. But I think, and this goes to what Adam was saying, and you were also saying, Barbara, earlier, in terms of the perpetual KYC and also the increased criminal efforts that a bank now does, criminal investigators actually did do, because especially now from a fintech perspective, we have access to much more data than just transactions. Obviously, we are actually positioned to also just monitor the activity. Like more and more financial apps or fintechs become part of a customer's lifestyle, and not only just the thing he or she does on the weekend. So it is possible to use this for criminal law enforcement, not only going to money laundering, but just regular criminals in that sense. And so as these technologies are not there yet, they are there in parts and not there holistically. It is a quite a big challenge for institutions to build a very cost-effective setup there. So most of the time now, fintechs or also bigger banks or so, they try to achieve everything, go in some direction, then they realize they have to invest in the other direction as well, and then you have a huge cost formula. Then you're trying to consolidate it, and then you're trying to reinvest it. What I'm also seeing right now in the market is a lot of regulatory pressure towards banks and institutions. You see it with the increase of fines in general, but also just the regulatory actions that has happened in Germany, for example, of the Wirecard, that are just increasing the regulatory scrutiny and regulatory expectations towards banks. And this goes along to a lot of investment into costs. And what I'm also seeing, and lastly, my last point there is that as we're moving in towards more of a data perspective, and most of the times the solutions are not there yet. There is a lot of tech costs associated, a lot of resources associated, and as the experts are not there yet, partly, that is then also affecting the cost perspective from a bank perspective, because you need to invest also tech resources, product resources, all these types of things, and it creates a huge burden on institutions right now, which I think will continue for the next 5 years.
Thanks for that, Thomas. I think the very good well, news from that, or conclusion from that for us, just to finish off, will be definitely there will be still jobs in financial crime compliance space. So with that optimistic conclusion, I think our time is up. Very much big thank you for the discussion. I think it was very insightful and interesting. I must conclude from my perspective, better than morning coffee. So many thanks to both of you for sharing your experiences and for being here with us today.
Thank you for having us.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you all.